This is the final episode of The Fall of Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan was the largest city in the world, according to some of my sources. The Spanish conquistadors described it as more beautiful and organized than anything in Spain at the time. You can look up artist renditions online of how the city might have been in the early 1500s. You'll see paintings of massive pyramids with temples on top. You'll see floating bridges, you'll see palaces. None of that exists today. The Spanish completely destroyed the city. So picking up where we left off in the last episode, the Spanish set out, supported by nearly 150,000 native warriors. They crossed the causeways again and got to work. They battled the remaining Aztecs for a few days. The enemy had by now holed up in the marketplace, where they were about to make their last stand. Cortez feigned a retreat to lure them into an ambush. 10 cavalrymen got their attention. The Aztecs chased them to an open square where 30 more cavalry were waiting. Cortez gave the attack order. The horses were devastating. Great numbers of Aztecs fell. Meanwhile, Alvarado was attacking the marketplace. They encountered heavy resistance, even though the opposing army was divided and starving and literally losing their minds. The Tlaxcalans burned Cuauhtémoc's palace to the ground. On July 1st, Alvarado sent up smoke, indicating that he had taken the marketplace. All that was left to do now was to slaughter the holdouts, including women and children. Cortez climbed the temple and saw the severed heads of his soldiers and allies on skull racks. He stood at the edge of the pyramid, hoping that any Aztecs who saw them there would give up. But pockets of eagle and jaguar knights still resisted. They were the most elite members of the Aztec military. For them, surrender was simply not an option. They refused to submit. The siege had gone on for 3 months, but the Aztecs remained defiant. They had taken refuge in houses on stilts along the lake shore. A man in Cortez's army knew how to build catapults, and he thought they could easily use one to tear down the buildings on the lake. They built it on top of a pyramid for dramatic effect. But as soon as they loaded stones into the sling, the catapult failed. The stones fell out and tumbled uselessly to the ground. They tried some repairs, but they just couldn't get it right. Cortez ordered them to dismantle it and hide it. Not wanting to look like fools, the Spanish taunted the Aztecs by saying they removed the catapult out of compassion for them, sparing their lives. By now, so many of the city's inhabitants had died from hunger or thirst that the stench of decomposing bodies filled the air. In the ensuing days, the Spanish claimed to have killed or enslaved more than 50,000 Aztec men, women, and children. Several Spanish accounts claim that 12,000 people were killed or captured in one day. Most of them put up no resistance. Cortez sent several messages to Cuauhtémoc, wanting to speak with him, but he was rebuked every time. So they continued their raids. Houses all over the city were filled with the dead and dying. Children wandered the streets crying. Women screamed and pounded their fists on walls. It was a city in its final throes. One of the world's biggest and, in some ways, most advanced civilizations had faced torture and starvation for months and was now dying. In the ransacking of Tenochtitlan, the Tlaxcalans were more than happy to brutalize their historic enemy. They murdered anyone they found in the streets. Cuauhtémoc must have known his empire was done. It had been happening for months. His army was forced out of their own city while the Spanish smashed everything. But he sent one of his greatest warriors to, maybe strike fear in the enemy, maybe display power. The warrior was dressed elegantly in the green feathers of the quetzal bird. Quote, Cuauhtémoc consulted with a group of his captains, and then called in a great captain called Opochtsin, who was a fabric dyer by trade. They dressed him in the finery of the quetzal owl. Then Cuauhtémoc said to him, This regalia belonged to my father, the great warrior Ahuitzotl. Terrify our enemies with it. Annihilate our enemies with it. Let them behold it and tremble. When our enemies saw him approach, they quaked as if they thought a mountain were about to fall on them. The quetzal owl climbed up onto a rooftop. When our enemies saw him, they came forward and prepared to attack him, but he succeeded in driving them away. 3 of the enemy soldiers were taken prisoner. Suddenly the battle ended. Neither side moved against the other. The night was calm and silent, with no incidents of any kind. On the following day, absolutely nothing took place, and neither the Spaniards nor the Indians spoke a word. Each side watched the other closely, but made no plans for launching an attack." Unquote. On August 12, 1521, an omen appeared in the city. In the years before the Spanish had arrived, the Aztecs allegedly saw several omens predicting the demise of their civilization. This was the final omen. An Aztec source writes, quote, "At nightfall it began to rain. Suddenly the omen appeared, blazing like a great bonfire in the sky. It wheeled in enormous spirals like a whirlwind and gave off a shower of sparks and red-hot coals. It also made loud noises, rumbling and hissing like a metal tube placed over a fire. It hovered for a while, then it moved out into the middle of the lake, where it suddenly disappeared. No one cried out when this omen came into view. The people knew what it meant, and they watched in silence." Unquote. The next morning, Cuauhtémoc fled the city. Now, the omens. This is another topic of debate. Did they really appear, or were they made up? If the omens are just fabrications, who fabricated them and why? It's possible that the people who wrote the codices, years after the events, were under pressure to make a narrative that conformed with the religious worldview of the Spanish monks who oversaw the writing process. A lot of the things that allegedly predicted Cortez's arrival seem a little too convenient, and we just don't have a lot of unbiased information to go on. Now Cortez was planning a final assault on the city. He instructed his men to find and capture the emperor so they could finally end the war. The armada, infantry, and cavalry all converged on the edge of town, where the holdouts were clinging to life. When they got there, the people were emaciated and barely put up a fight. They tried to flee. Cortez writes, quote, "The people of the city had to walk upon their dead, while others swam or drowned in the waters. So great was their suffering that it was beyond our understanding how they could endure it." Unquote. The siege had gone almost exactly as Cortez had planned. The Aztecs write, quote, "The flight from the city began, and with this the war came to an end. Some fled across the lake, others along causeways, and even then there were many killings. The grown-ups carried their young children on their shoulders. Many of the children were weeping with terror, but a few of them laughed and smiled, thinking it was great sport to be carried like that along the road." Unquote. Warships were still engaging Aztec canoes, but this time, rather than filling the lake, there were only about 50. In the distance, a canoe paddled away, and a warship gave pursuit. As they got closer, the men in the canoe yelled at the Spanish not to attack because the emperor was aboard. When Cortez got word of this, he ordered his men not to harm Cuauhtémoc, but to bring the ruler to him right away. They prepared a meeting place and filled a table with food. He laid down a literal red carpet. His translator and mistress, Malinche, was, as always, at his side to allow the men to communicate. When the Aztec king saw Cortez, he pointed at his dagger. He said, "I have already done everything in my power to defend my kingdom and free it from your hands. And since my fortune has not been favorable, take my life. And this will put an end to the Mexican kingdom, since you have destroyed my cities and killed my vassals." Cortez responded by saying he wished Cuauhtémoc had surrendered earlier, as they could have avoided so much destruction. He told the emperor to eat and rest so that they could discuss the terms of the surrender. They met again the following day, and Cortez asked for all the gold that they had lost on the Noche Triste. Cuauhtémoc knew he would ask this question, so he told his men to bring forth what little gold they had smuggled onto his canoe. Cortez was not impressed, but Cuauhtémoc told him there was no more, and he had a request. "Let my people leave the city and heal in more peaceful towns." Cortez agreed. The dead were cremated. As people fled the city, the Spanish harassed them, looking for gold. They strip-searched people but found very little. The best-looking women and the strongest-looking men were grabbed, branded as slaves, and forced into a life of servitude. Again, quoting Portilla, "The Spanish soldiers were stationed along the roads to search the fleeing inhabitants. They were looking only for gold. The women carried their gold under their skirts, and the men carried it in their mouths or under their loincloths. Some of the women, knowing they would be searched if they looked prosperous, covered their faces with mud and dressed themselves in rags. But the Spaniards searched all the women without exception." Unquote. Cortez left 300 men in charge of cleaning up Tenochtitlan while he went to the nearby city of Coyoacan to celebrate victory. Wine and pigs were brought in from Veracruz, and Spanish women had arrived from Cuba. So many people showed up that they ran out of space. The party went a little overboard, and the next morning they held a mass. The priests forgave their sins. Later, after contemplating the tiny amount of gold they had been able to steal, Cortez again demanded that Cuauhtemoc produce more of it. The defeated king said nothing, so Cortez's men tortured him. They tied him to a pole, poured boiling oil on his feet, and lit them on fire. But the king remained defiant. The men brought the king of Tacuba and tortured him in the same way. This time, Cuauhtemoc said they had dumped it deep in the lake, so the Spanish could never find it. The king of Tacuba died, but eventually Cortez let Cuauhtemoc go free. Cortez sent teams of divers to retrieve the gold, but they found almost nothing. His men began complaining, but he told them that they now owned the entire country that had produced the massive wealth they wanted. If they would be patient, he could grant them land and slaves to work their fields. The siege lasted 80 days, and the death toll was high. More than 200,000 Aztecs died and 30,000 Tlaxcalans. Word of the devastation spread quickly throughout the region. People flocked from faraway cities to see if it was really true, to see if the Aztec Empire had really been destroyed. Cortez was a better expedition leader than public administrator, so in order to get things back to some kind of normalcy, they needed the old Aztec bureaucrats to run the city on a day-to-day level. He had people begin to rebuild the metropolis, which was renamed Mexico City. The rulers needed taxes to keep their system running, but taxes require living people able to produce wealth. Mexico was just not able to provide the same levels of money and free labor that were possible before the war and before smallpox. Indigenous people were forced into slavery and worked in gold mines until they collapsed. Everybody needed food, but the farmers were now working in mines. Taxes had to be in gold or produce. The Spanish would not accept other traditional forms of taxes like cacao beans and seashells. Some of the conquistadors were bored by the lack of exploration, pillage, and conquest, so they went to Central America or sailed for Florida. Martin Lopez, the shipbuilder, and several others sued Cortez for failure to pay wages he owed them. Cortez led an expedition to Honduras, thinking he could find more gold there. He brought Cuauhtemoc with him because he thought the ex-emperor would know how to find the gold. Cuauhtemoc tried to lead a rebellion but failed and was hanged. Malinche gave birth to Cortez's son, Martin. Years later, a plot was hatched to overthrow Spain's viceroy in Mexico and make Martin king. The conspirators were executed, and Martin was banished from Mexico. Cortez was given the title of Marquis of the Valley of Oaxaca. He didn't settle in Oaxaca, though. He kept exploring, eventually getting to the land he would name California, after the name of a fictional place in a novel he read. He went to Spain a few times after the destruction of Tenochtitlan for different reasons. He died in Spain, and his remains were shipped to Mexico City. Historian Richard Grabman sums up Cortez's legacy in the eyes of most Mexicans of non-Spanish descent. Quote, Diego Rivera's mural in the National Palace gave Cortez his Mexican image, malignant, sickly, hollow-eyed, and fanatical. There are no streets or towns named for Cortez in Mexico. The only statue of him in the Republic is in a Cuernavaca hotel lobby, commissioned by a United States citizen, not a Mexican. Unquote. The indigenous religions of Mexico began to mix elements of Catholicism with their own traditions. It's a strategy that allowed parts of their history to stay alive as the Catholic Church tried to wipe all local religions out. And it's what always happens in Mexico. The people here don't resist things completely. They find elements of foreign ideologies, religions, and economic systems that are already somewhat built into their own cultures, and they mix things together. Today, if you go to a restaurant for pizza, it'll come with bottles of ketchup, hot sauce, and soy sauce. Buses don't go in a straight line down city streets in a grid format. They make absurd detours, and if there's too much traffic, the driver will just find a way around it. They have universities that feel similar to ones in the US and Europe, but students and teachers arrive when they want. Individualized testing happens, but group projects are where the students really do their best work. Cheating is as much about getting ahead as it is about making sure everyone passes. Even the Spanish language has been streamlined, modernized, updated, and mixed with a huge amount of indigenous words. So the Spanish came and destroyed Tenochtitlan and then built something resembling a normal city in Spain. But in Mexico City, there are miles and miles of open-air markets selling the same stuff today as they did 500 years ago. The Spanish tried to impose themselves on every detail of Mexican life, but the people who escaped into the forests and mountains were largely able to protect themselves. To this day, they make the same foods, prepare the same drinks, speak the same languages, and practice a lot of the same religious rituals as ever. And the old enemies of the Aztecs are still forced to pay taxes to an enormous, unresponsive, and unaccountable bureaucracy. So how much has really changed?